me praying for you.
Yes, for sure. Please let us know how we can help you in any way that we can to live your life on purpose. We believe God has good things in store for his people, and it's my hope that your faith and joy will increase as he speaks to you through this message.
You guys ready? Okay. So again, back to the statement that I said that I never, ever thought I'd be up here. It's funny how God works. It's funny how sometimes he uses someone else. He tells someone else your calling, just so that they can help mentor you. They can help pour into you. They can help prepare you. That came in November of last year. I was here maybe 6-7 months, and the Lord spoke to Ben and said that I had a word for the church. When he told me that, inside I was like, you have no idea that I passed out in Communications 101, like smack dab in the middle of everyone, just laid out. Like, I'm not willing to try that again. But my response to him was, thank you for believing in me, and I'll pray about it. It's my political response, right? So November led to February. In February, I lost my mom. It was a very trying time, a very hard time to get through, and through that, I had an option. I had an option to get swallowed by that situation, or I had an option to walk through it and see how God wanted to use that situation in my life. We all have that opportunity. It doesn't matter what situations come up, what circumstances. When you give it over to God, he's the one that takes that option and changes it for you, right? So, this month, we have been talking about in transit. So I feel blessed to even be up here to talk about this because I sure know a little bit about being in transit and what that feels like. So this month, we have talked about traffic signs. That was the first sermon, and we talked about how sometimes when we're in transit, we're focusing on the signs that we want instead of the signs in our current situation that God is putting in front of us. The second one is routine maintenance, and this is by far one that really spoke to me because he talks about heart health, how building that deeper spiritual relationship with God will make us more reliable, more durable, and ultimately more value to our community. And that's what really just took me by surprise of what I had been through while I was in transit. So, before we start about the message today, I like to start with stories, just to get you on the same page. Take a trip down my day in the life of Ashley. So not last weekend, but the weekend before that, my husband took me on a surprise trip. He had babysitters for the kids, and he took me onto a trip to Kaibab, Arizona, to go bison hunting. Surprise! I had to remind him I'm a vegetarian, but that didn't matter. So I'd like to reclassify that to bison sitting, because we sat a whole lot in a tent. And finally, when I said enough is enough, let's go find these bison, because you get to a point where you don't care anymore about the hunt. You're just like, or you don't care about the sitting and the rules. You're like, I want to go find this bison. So Kaibab is right up by the Grand Canyon. So we took a trip up to the Grand Canyon, down to the basin, and we were like, we're going to find these bison. So this basin is like a meadow. It's like a field. Well, of course, they're not going to be just hanging out in clear sights. We had to go up into the tree line, and we're like four-wheeling up this mountain, okay? Like, this road is just a one path. I call it a path because it's like total terrain with just two lines, like just two wheel marks. And so we're literally going up into the tree line, up over this cliff, down the cliff, up another cliff, down another cliff. You get it. So my fight or flight reflexes go off. So I'm like freaking out inside. And so I look calm and collected, but I'm like, okay, my husband has done this before. We'll be fine. The truck is made for this. We will be fine. Other people have done this and survived, or else there wouldn't be two wheel paths that we're following. We will survive. And then up at the top of the cliff going down, I'm like, situations, that you're facing the unknown, how your mind wants to recalculate you to get you back to your comfort zone that was not comfortable. So everything in me, all the fear, was pointing me back to my comfort zone. So in that moment, I started getting convicted. I started thinking, I'm gonna be honest, I was back in my comfort zone. We were done four-wheeling, I was in my tent, bison sitting. And I started to digest these feelings that I had. And I started realizing that that fear was due to the fact that I lost trust in the truck's ability to grip the road. I lost trust in the ability for my husband to quickly steer out of the path of danger. I ultimately lost trust while in transit due to the great unknown that was in my current situation. That situation convicted me about my constant fear of failing, or that constant fear of failure. And that in that time of fearing or fear of failure, that it's the lack of trust in the unknown of your current situation. And that lack of trust in the unknown will keep you where you've always been. But that's not God's plan. So I'm excited to add the third series to In Transit, titled Recalculating. Recalculating is basically a GPS term. And it's funny how we feel so comfortable following our GPS to somewhere that we've never been before. We just follow its directions, and when we get off track, it prompts us it's recalculating your new directions. How similar is that to God in our lives? His mercy is made new, and He will direct us to our purpose no matter how many mistakes or how many U-turns we make. He's constantly recalculating us. So I want to just quickly pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for everyone here today, Father. I pray that this message will just speak to everyone here, Father. I know that it has been something that I've been living out over the last couple of months. I pray that what you want to get across will get across. I pray that everyone will just open their ears, open their heart, and just see how this correlates with possible situations that they're going through, or possible ups and downs that they're facing. And that I pray that ultimately we walk out of here recalculating our mindset, that fear no longer owns us, fear no longer directs our path, Father, and that we walk out here ready to respond with a yes, that we're ready to follow the path that you have made for us. And ultimately, Father, I pray that today we will walk out knowing our calling and our purpose in Jesus' name. All right. So how many times have you guys felt fear of failure? Does that resonate with you, that fear of failing?
Yes.
Okay. So I had to think about all of the times that I've had fear of failure. That fear of failure keeps us from something better. It's even kept me from getting a better job because I was fearful, first off, that I wasn't going to be good enough, and I was fearful of the unknown of that job. So it kept me in the space that I was in. Or I was fearful of standing up for myself because I didn't know if I was going to fail or succeed in that moment. What about self-sabotage? That's a form of fear of failure. Self-sabotaging, where you actually don't try your hardest just to limit that sting of failure or not being successful. There was a time that I was so worried to fail that I thought my entire worth was wrapped up in what I did and how well I did it. But you won't be able to sustain that. It's crazy how much value we put on success. And we leave no room for failure. No room for failure. But I would like to recalculate the formula for success today. I think we think that there's no room for failure in success. I would like to flip that and say you truly can't succeed until you fail. Because I mean, even success starts with suck, right? It's okay to fail. I mean, we don't expect things happen, right? I mean, research in the Bible. So if you guys want to believe me that success starts with suck, I'll read it to you in the Bible here. So I picked 3 passages that I want to go over with you guys today, and I am so excited to go over these stories. So if I'm a little bit overly excited, it's been something I've been really passionate about here. So the first I want to talk about is the story of Moses. Okay? We remember the boldness of Moses. We remember the plagues that God sent. We remember the miracles that God did to save his people. But do you remember, if we rewind, Moses' story, he started off as an orphan. That fear for his life, his mother put him in reeds and water. He was an orphan as a baby. He was adopted by Egyptians, an unknown people. And when he grew up, he ended up killing an Egyptian and fled out of fear so that he wouldn't die. Isn't that funny how his start and where he was kind of repeated itself? So this story, when God called Moses to his purpose and said, go save my people, I want to focus on Moses' response. Moses' response was, but who am I? In Exodus 4:10 it said, "O Lord, I'm not eloquent. I am slow of speech. I am slow of tongue." How many of us can relate to that same exact response? That we relate to that fear that comes from falling short, or that self-doubt. I mean, I totally relate to this story, because when Ben told me he wanted me to preach, this is exactly what went through my head. That self-doubt, that falling short. But that's not the truth. The truth is that we will always, or we will all fall short, but God calls us still to step out. The next story I want to share is the story of Jonah. Jonah got famous by getting swallowed by a giant fish. He got famous for surviving in the fish's stomach for 3 days. And then, surprise, surprise, Andy, he gets vomited out on the shore just in time to save 120,000 people from Nineveh. That's pretty amazing. But when you start at the beginning of his story, this is a story of self-sabotage. Jonah was a priest who deliberately disobeyed God's calling on his life. Jonah thought he knew best, and that he didn't want to succeed, or if he succeeded, God would win, so he failed. He ran away, and Jonah's response to God's calling was to run away and flee from the Lord. This can look as simple as our day-to-day of knowing truth and still doing what we want. We all do that. We've all fled or just turned off our conviction. This can even look like God calling you to speak into the life of someone that's hurt you, but your feelings are too validated that you don't want to encourage that person. God never asks us to be in control of our circumstances. We are only in control of our response. So my favorite story is that of Simon Peter. Simon Peter demonstrates that sometimes our faith will take us to a place that we may fail, so that our trust is forced to transition. I'm going to say that one more time because it's so good. Sometimes your faith will take you to a place that you might fail, but it's so that your trust is forced to transition. So Simon Peter was a fisherman by trade. He was successful at it. He made money at it. But he was called to become a fisherman of men and to follow Jesus. That was completely unknown to Simon Peter. He knew how to fish for fish. He did not know how to fish for men. And do you know what his response was? It was an action. He literally, physically dropped his fishing net and started to follow Jesus. But even Simon Peter witnessed fear and failure. So I'm going to read to you Peter's story, and and then I'm going to get in the boat, because we're all in a boat. So if you want to go ahead and share on the slide, Matthew 14, and we're going to start at 24. On the screen, it's actually an NIV, and this morning I kind of switched it up, and I'm going to be reading out of the Message. So I hope that doesn't confuse you, but the Message is just a little bit more clear, and I wanted to read it from here. It says, "Meanwhile the boat was far out to sea." So at this time, this comes after all of the miracles of Jesus. He had just had supper for 5,000 people, where he duplicated the fish, and it fed 5,000 people, and they had 7 baskets left over. So they had already seen all of this, the disciples. And at that time, Jesus always took some time for himself, and he went to the mountain to pray. He did his routine maintenance, and he told the disciples to go ahead and go across the sea to the other bank where they were going next. So this comes in, it says, "Meanwhile the boat was far out to sea when the winds came up against them, and they were battered by the waves. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came towards them walking on the water. They were scared out of their wits. 'A ghost,' they cried, crying out in terror. But Jesus was quick to comfort them. 'Courage, it is me, don't be afraid.' Peter, suddenly bold, said, 'Master, if it's really you, call me to come to you on the water.' And he said, 'Come ahead.' Jumping out of the boat, Peter walked on the water to Jesus. But when he looked down at the waves churning beneath his feet, he lost his nerve and started to sink. He cried, 'Master, save me.' Jesus didn't hesitate. He reached down and grabbed his hand. Then he said, 'Faint heart, what got into you?' The two of them climbed back in the boat, and the winds died down. And the disciples in the boat, having watched the whole thing, worshiped Jesus, saying, 'This is it, you are God's Son, for sure.'" So I just want to do a quick illustration, because I'm going to say this, you're not going to believe this, but I wish we had a bigger boat, because this one fit 12 people, and I think this one could fit maybe 8 if we were really small. But I'll let that slide, this time only. So all 12 disciples were in the boat. They were facing a storm. They said they were getting battered around, and when they saw Jesus walking on the water, their first response, they shouted in fear and said, "It's a ghost." So I'm trying to envision this. I'm on a boat, it's rocking. I'm fearful because I'm in a storm. I'm guessing a fog came in, and so they're seeing just an image of Jesus walking on the water. But I want to tell you a common acronym for fear. Fear is the false evidence appearing real. So in that moment, out of their fear, they saw a ghost. The man that they had been walking next to for almost 3 years, side by side. Even his voice saying, "Do not be afraid, it is I." They were still fearful, and the only one that stood up was Peter. So out of fear, out of that false evidence appearing real, they shouted out in fear. But Peter said, "If it is you," which is still a very doubtful sentence. "If it is you, then call me out on the water." Jesus didn't say, "Peter, come." He said, "Come." Peter was the only one that stepped out of the boat. So imagine you getting rocked around, and to stand, it had to be difficult. They said he jumped, he stood up, okay, imagine, and stepped out. It didn't say he fell on his face. It said he jumped out of the boat. I mean, how many times have we let our current situation, something that seems so scary, something that we have no control over, and we hunker down in our comfort zone because we feel like this is our safe spot? We're recalculating to get us back into our comfort zone. But Peter was the one that stepped out of his comfort and went to Jesus. I looked through all of the Gospels, and do you know that Matthew is the only one that talks about Peter walking on water? Even Mark, who was written by Mark and Peter together, there's nothing about Peter walking on water. And I think it's because he didn't find it relevant to mention his failure. What can someone learn from my failure? But what I saw is that even in the midst of failure, he stepped out in faith and he started to sink, because what he did is that from looking at Jesus to looking at his circumstance, the circumstance was unknown to him. The waters deep brought fear to him, and he didn't know what was next. He began to sink. So he focused on something that brought him fear, and he began to sink. He called out to Jesus, and it says Jesus didn't hesitate. He never hesitates in our situation to reach down and bring us comfort. So Peter not only stood in the midst of his storm, but he stepped out. He stepped out. Jesus didn't hesitate, brought him in, and they both walked back to the boat together. And once they got back in the boat, the winds died down, and all of the disciples looked at Jesus and said, "This is it. You are God's son for sure." Fast forward through Matthew 16, when Jesus was once again alone with his disciples. This is my favorite. He says, "Who do you say I am?" Peter was the first one to stand up and say, "You are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Isn't that funny how it repeats itself? Just a moment ago, the disciples were saying, it is you, the Son of God. And now he asks them again, "Who do you say I am?" The first person to answer was Peter. His name was Simon, and Simon means breeze, something that can be blown around in the wind. When Simon answered, he said, "You are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And when Jesus responded, his response was, "You are Peter, the rock, that I will build my church on." When you tell God who he is, he will tell you who you are. No matter what your situation is. And through his failure, he found out what his promise was. Sometimes, through your failure, God transitions you to your promise, where your trust in him can sustain us, where it can sustain you. So we were never guaranteed success. But if we fail, our failure also requires trust. If you think about Peter's failure, he actually stepped out into the water in faith. And if you look at the other disciples that stayed in the boat, they never experienced his failure, but they never experienced walking on water. So they all had an opportunity to step out, but in that moment, their fear clouded their judgment, and they decided to stay in the boat. But again, it wasn't until both Jesus and Peter came back to the boat that their storm actually stopped. There's a level of trust to take that step out. And some of us don't ever even take the first step to stand. Faith will get you there, but your trust is what will keep you there. So again, I'm not saying that you're required to fail. I'm just saying it's okay to fail. I want to remove fear from your decision-making process. I don't want fear to rule you or own you of what your next step is. Again, fear is false evidence appearing real. We saw when the disciples made that decision out of fear, they called Jesus a ghost. Through all of these examples that I just shared with you of fear and failure, none of these stopped them from success. I started with their successes, but none of them didn't experience success. You know, when you look up fear in the Bible, everywhere you find fear, you find trust. And everywhere you find trust, it's about not having fear. I will trust in you and not fear. I will trust in your word that you will sustain me. Trust brings confidence and repels fear from our lives. Trust brings confidence that repels fear from our lives. Trust allows us to rest in God's promises as we await answers to our prayers in any situation. When we trust God, we allow Him to make the final say in our lives, knowing full well that He will not abandon us. So why did I talk about these three passages today? Because they all have one thing in common. They all got stopped while in transition or in transit by waters deep. These waters represent our journey called life. Or you can also call it the great unknown. But when we're faced with life, when we're faced with battles, when we're faced with ups and downs, or storms that never end, or that we're just trying to keep our head above water, or we're drowning in debt, how many times have you used water to explain your current situation? In these three passages, they also had to respond with faith and stand. Moses, he had to stand at the water's edge, and he had to declare the water to obey, and it parted. Jonah had to stand up, and he had to confess that he was running from God, even though he knew he was going to get thrown overboard. Peter, he had to stand in the midst of a storm and get out of the boat. None of these sound very comfortable. None of these sound comfortable, but your comfort is where His presence is, not your comfort zone. I'm going to say that again. Because your comfort is where His presence is, not your comfort zone. Because the storm didn't die until Jesus stepped into the boat. Your comfort zone is where His presence is, not where your comfort zone is. I don't want to let fear keep us stagnant any longer. I want to remove fear that pulls us to our comfort zone. And I want to remove that because your comfort zone is only as large as the amount of control you have. And if this is my amount of control, Lord, I want more. I don't want to limit myself. I want to step out of that box because I know God has more for me. And we all know that the only thing that we can control is ourselves and our response. So I want to challenge you guys today to start listening to God's calling and challenge you to say yes. To say yes. What's the worst that can happen? You might fail. Well, I would like to say there's a saying that says fail forward. So if you say yes and you fail, I say you're just one step closer to failing into God's arms. You're just failing into God's calling. You're just falling into your purpose. I want to take fear out of your response to say yes, because failure isn't that bad. We are in control of our response to the challenges we face. And we have the option to walk through it, to get swallowed by it, or to walk on top of it. So today, if any of these current situations or these stories spoke to you, if you feel a tugging of your heart, I want to tell you that is your call to say yes, to stand in faith and to step out. That God is calling us into our purpose and into our calling. And if you feel like today fear is the umpire of your decision making, I challenge you to remove that fear and to walk out into faith. And if today, doesn't matter what situation you're going through, if you feel like you're in a battle and that storm is taking you down, and if today marks that enough is enough, I would like to say, in the waters deep, Will your faith stand? Will you step out of the boat or be fearful in your comfort zone? I'd like the prayer team to come up here. Prayer is so important because we were not meant to battle alone. God has built us up in community because there's no one-man army that has ever won a war. And we're constantly in battles. And I know that all of you are going through something. And no one's is worse than someone else's because we're all struggling. But I want to welcome you guys to receive prayer. If you are in something that is just too hard to carry alone, I would like to invite you guys up. And this is not, there's no judgment, but I'm gonna let Lewis sing, and I want you guys to all stand up, because we're gonna walk into some worship. But I invite you into that place of God's comfort. If you guys would like to come up to the front and worship together, step out. Sometimes God is just looking for your response to a yes. So let's step out of our boats, leave fear of failure behind you, and stand in His presence. We're here to pray with you, and if you're ready, we're ready. Thank you.
You called me out upon the waters, the great unknown, my feet made of faith. There I find you in the mystery, in oceans deep, my faith will stand. And I will call upon your name, and keep my eyes above your waves, and oceans rise, so rest in your embrace. But I am yours, and you are mine. wherever you would call me. And take me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and my faith would be made stronger in the presence of my Savior. Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let me walk upon the waters wherever you would call me. Take me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and my faith could be made stronger in the presence of my Savior. Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let me walk upon the waters wherever you would call me. Take me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and my faith could be made stronger in the presence of my Savior. Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let me walk upon the waters wherever you would call me. Take me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and my faith could be made stronger in the presence of my Savior. Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let me walk upon the waters wherever you would call me. Take me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and my faith would be made stronger in the presence of my Savior. And I will walk on your name and keep my eyes above the oceans rise. My soul will rest where I am. You are mine. I don't think we're done yet tonight. So let's sing this one more time. Come on, if you're willing, if you're able, if you got something on your heart, come to the front this morning. Come to the front, come lay it down this morning. Let this boat be your altar. Let it be a place where you lay down everything, where you jump out. Come on, listen. Spirit. Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Sing it out. You walk upon the waters wherever you would call me. Take me deeper than my love being in community with you. So if you're willing, if you're able, come talk to us. Come hang out with us. Come tell us about your life. If you need prayer, don't miss out on this opportunity to receive prayer this morning. There are people up here who love you, who want to be in it with you, who want to fight the battle with you. So we're going to continue just playing music. You guys are more than welcome to head out if you got to. We love you. Thank you so much for being with us this weekend.